Hey guys, welcome back to the next animation video. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make 5 different lower third titles. Now, each of these are building on a new principle and following on from some of the principles that we learned in the previous video. So let's dive straight in. So this is the first animation that we're going to be making here. So what I'm going to do is just right click, create a new composition. These settings can be whatever you like to match your project and then hit OK. So first I just want to create some new text. Now you can set up your character settings to be whatever you like. I've just typed out some text here. It doesn't really matter. I'm then going to take that layer, I'm just going to duplicate it, and I want to drag this second one down here and then add my second title. Generally with this one, we make it a little bit thinner and then we scale it down in size. So now that you've got your text position wherever you want, we want to animate the text. So to do this, again, I'm going to use one of the presets. I come up here down to text and then animate in. Now for this one, I'm going to use the typewriter effect and I want to drag it straight onto both of these layers. If I select those, I can hit U, bring up those keyframes and then drag in on these keyframes. And there you go, we have that animation. I can also right click, make these easy ease, and that just smooths that animation out. So that's really simple, and you can use any of those different basically presets just by dragging them straight onto your text. Next, I want to create that little box that goes around the outside. So we've done this before in the previous video. I just select my pen tool, make sure I have nothing selected down here. I want to make sure my fill is set to none, and then I can add a slight stroke effect here. Now I can adjust this later, but I'm just going to set it to be something like this. And then I can start by drawing out my basically path here that I want to follow. Now it's not perfect and that's okay, we can readjust that. But then what I can do is I can come down under the shape settings here, and under the stroke settings I can also scale this up and down. Now if I select that, I can readjust these just to make them all evenly line up. It helps if I'm holding down Shift because then I can basically get them into the right position. And now I'm ready to start animating. So like we did in the previous video with stroke effects, as you know, we're going to just add the trims path and that will allow us to animate this. I can create an endpoint here, scale this all the way to 0, move across on my timeline, and then scale this up. If I make these easy ease, I can then go into my graph editor and then scale this like this. So we get that nice little animation. I can even drag out on this to slow that animation down. And we have that finished animation. So that's just reinforcing what we've learned in the previous video. Again, it's good to get your head around this because it's something you're going to be using a lot of inside of After Effects. Okay, so let's move on to our next example here. So this is when we start to use another really common effect, which is basically using shapes to reveal certain layers. And that could be text, it could be an image, it could be anything, but we're gonna have hidden layers. So I wanna show you a few different ways we can do this. So I'm going to start by creating a new composition. Again, the settings can be whatever you like. Then I'm just going to add my text to my scene. So I've just added those 2 texts that are not animated at all. And now I want to create the bars that go across. So I'm going to come up here to my rectangle tool. This time I want to have a fill. And I'm just going to choose a color here. Any color, it doesn't matter. And I don't want a stroke effect on this particular shape. Now I can draw out a shape which covers up my top title here. So just something that looks like this, right? So don't worry, it's covering the text at the moment. We're just focusing on creating this shape. Under the rectangle settings, what I can do is there's a few ways I can animate this. I can come down to the transform settings. Now you can use the transform settings for the entire layer, or you can use them for the rectangle path. Either way, they're going to have the same result. But as I scale up and down on these layers, you can see it animates from the anchor point of that layer. So in the previous module there was a video talking about anchor points. This is the point in which your layer is going to move around. So that could be scale, it could be position, whatever it is. it's going to move around that. And we want it to basically animate in from one side. So if I come up here and use my pan behind tool, which is Y on the keyboard, I can move that little point to the edge of my layer. Now, when I scale this up and down, it's scaling from that position. If I undo that little lock icon, now I can just control basically the X axis. So what I'm going to do is create a scale position here. I just want to scale this all the way to 0. I'll go across on my timeline and then just scale this back up to 100. So if we play through that, we get this animation. The other thing I can do is just right click on these and make them both easy ease just to smooth out that animation. Another thing I can do is also add motion blur for that layer and for that composition. So that's going to add a little bit of motion blur just to make it a bit more interesting. I can also take those again, go into my graph editor and bring these points in like this. So that just creates a bit more of a nice smooth animation. So what I want to do is I want to basically start by naming this layer. So I'm just going to call this one blue bar. This always is a good idea in doing anything inside of After Effects just to help you organize your layers. I can then duplicate that and then off center that layer. And if I off center that layer, it's now going to basically animate in another layer over the top, but we can't see that until I change the color. So with my background, what I'm going to do is change the color to be a gray or something, just a different color. And now we've got two different shape layers. I can even exaggerate that by moving that even further out. I can then duplicate that layer again. And with that middle one selected, I can now change that to be a white color. And there you go, we have that animation of all of those different shapes basically over the top of each other. So next what I want to do is take these layers and then just move them down to the bottom. So our text is now sitting on top. So at the moment we've got that bar, but we want to animate now the text layers moving in. So I'm going to do this one at a time. I'm just going to turn off that bottom layer and just focus on the top. And what I can do is when the layer starts coming on to about here, what I can do is I can hit P on my keyboard and create a position keyframe there. And then another one here. And if I move this one back and then down, we can basically create a nice little animation like this. If I grab both of these, make them easy ease, that just basically creates a smooth motion. Now at the moment we can see that layer, and this is a really common problem inside of After Effects. You want to basically animate things from a hidden layer. So where we can't see them, it looks like they're revealing out of nothing. Now remember, this is on a transparent background. So we can see that text, but when we hide it, we won't be able to see it until it moves into that shape path. So we only want it to reveal once it's inside this layer. Now there's a couple of ways we can do this, but in this particular example, I want to show you one of those ways. So with that text layer, I want to come up to Effect down to Channel, and I'm going to use the Set Matte. Now in the previous module in the Learn After Effects, there was a video talking about track mattes. This is exactly what this is. So we were using the track mattes down here. Now this is exactly the same as just applied up here. So what I want to do is it's saying I want to take the track matte from the layer and apply it to this. So I want to take the layer from the blue bar. So from this blue bar, which is the one down the bottom, I want to use that as my track matte. So you can see as we do that, it's now hidden that layer. I can turn this on and off and you can see that it's now only revealing. I can do the opposite. If I hit invert, it's now only revealing that layer as it's moving behind. So this is a really useful function inside of After Effects. And again, this is something you're going to be using a lot of. So let's do this again, but this time for our bottom layer. So I want them to animate at the same time. So I'm going to hit P, create a position keyframe, and then another one there, and then just drag up on this. Make these easy ease, and then come up here and apply that same Set Matte. And again, I want to apply the blue bar, but this time I want to hit the invert because I don't want it to be basically seen until it's coming out. Now at the start here, we can see that because the blue bar is not fully out yet. It's basically still animating in. So a way we can get around this is by dragging in so we don't see that layer until it's hidden. Right, so that's one way of doing that. I can add a bit of motion blur and there you go, we have that finished effect. So that's how you create that and use the set matte to do that. So this is the next title we're going to be creating here. I'm starting by creating a new composition. As always, these settings can be whatever you like. So in the previous example, we looked at using a shape to basically hide those layers. But what happens when you don't have a shape, right? So there's no box for us to hide our layer behind. It basically looks like it's coming out of a very thin line. So we're using similar principles, just slightly different again. So again, I've added my text in here. It's not animated, it's just sitting there. I want to start by creating the stroke line first. So I'm just going to grab my pen tool here and create a stroke line that goes through the middle. Again, I don't want this to have a fill and I want this to have a stroke effect. And you've done this before, you can come down to the shape path and then I want to add a trims path. And under the trims path, we're going to basically animate this line by creating keyframes. So we've got that line animating in. You've done this all before. It's just good to get into that habit of doing that. Okay, so now I want to animate the text. So let's just start with my top layer here. So as this is animating on, I want to basically create a position keyframe and then have this animate to that position. I want to drag this down so it's hidden and then it basically moves up like this. So another way of doing this when you don't have a shape layer is we can use masks to hide that layer. So what I can do is if I come up here and use my rectangle tool with that layer selected, what it will do is it'll create a mask that sits over the top, right? So this only happens when you select that layer, as we've seen in the previous module. And as I move this or play through, it's following that layer and we want it to basically animate as the layer's moving on. So we have to create an animation for that mask path. So we create a mask path keyframe. And then at the start here, what I can do is select that mask and drag it up. So as that plays through, you can see we get that it's following that animation. Basically, it's basically not moving as the layer is moving up inside. Now, if you've added easy ease to the position of that thing, then you'll have to also add that same movement to that layer. So that's one drawback with this method, is it can be a little bit tricky to get it to match to that position of the layer that you're basically trying to mask out, right? So if you've got a complex sort of graph movement of the bottom position, then you will have to add that exact same position to that mask. So this works really well if you just got a simple movement, right? But that's one way of doing this. It also works similar in the matte that if I hit invert, we can do the same thing again. Now let's just do that once more with this layer. So I'm going to hit P on the keyboard, create another position keyframe. Then I can grab my pen tool here and draw out a mask. I have to animate this mask here at the start. And if I select both of these, I can make them easy ease and then just make any fine tune adjustments here to make that mask follow that line. So then one last thing is you can add a bit of motion blur to all those layers and that just makes that a little bit more interesting. So that's another way of using masks to then hide layers. So in our next example, I want to show you another way of combining what we've done in the previous two steps, but then applying it in another way again. So I'm going to create a new composition. So I've just brought my new text layers in here and just position them next to each other in this sort of layout. Now I want to add a new little line that sits through the middle here. So I'm just going to create a new line that runs up through the middle. And then again, I can go through and animate this. I know it feels repetitive with these animations, but it's a good habit to get into of just practicing with these. And just make these easy ease, just to get that nice little movement there. All right, so now we've got that. We want to animate these layers in. So previously we looked at using masks, but for these ones, what I want to do is just start with my main layer here, and I want to animate this in. So as the line animates up, I then want this to animate in. So I'm just going to create a nice animation here of this layer going across. Make this easy. Make this easy ease. Then we have that line animating across. So another way of doing this reveal is by drawing an invisible shape. So the way we do this is we come up here and just make sure we have nothing selected. I'm just going to draw out a shape layer. Now I need to make sure that this has a fill on it. It can be whatever color, we're not going to actually see it, so it doesn't actually matter. Then I need to drag this down so it sits above my text layer, right? So my text layer is hidden by this. Then if I go to the toggle modes, we're going to use the track matte settings. So this is exactly the same as what we were doing before with that effect, with the set matte, but this time we're using the track matte settings down here. So with that, now what I can do is I want to say, okay, use the alpha matte of that layer above. So that hides that layer. You can see that it's disappeared, but it's using that as a matte. So if I select that, you can see where that mask is, or that shape layer, and it's animating in that layer. I can also hit invert, and that's going to do the opposite, right? So this is quite a useful function, but keep in mind that we can't see that. It's a hidden layer, and that's really good because we don't want to see that in our final product. So this is a much easier way if you have more complex animations, because you don't have to animate this layer's movement or position or path or whatever it's going to be. It's always going to basically reveal when that text moves behind it. So let's just duplicate that layer and drag it above that same shape layer and move it over here this time, and then do the same thing with this layer. So I want to turn on this second layer here, animate the position, and then set my matte to be alpha matte of that shape path. So we basically have this hidden layer, something like this. Now keep in mind, you can only do this for the layer above, so I can't use that same shape and use it for all of these text layers at once. Whereas using the set matte feature, which we had before, I can apply that to multiple layers. So it's basically a copy and paste effect over multiple layers. It doesn't work in every circumstance, as we're going to find out, but it does work really well for something like this, where you can only draw one mask or one shape layer and then just copy and paste that onto the different layers. But that's another way of doing it. I tend to use this quite a lot for more complex animations. All right, so let's look at our final example here, where we have a line and we're combining a few different techniques here together. So I'm going to start by creating a new composition, and I've positioned my two text layers here. They're not animated at all. So let's start by animating the text layers. So I can select that layer, I can come up here and add the effect that I want to add. For this top one, I'm going to use the typewriter effect. I'm just going to hit U to bring up those keyframes, drag in, make these easy ease, and go to the graph editor and just smooth out this entire animation. So that just makes it look a little bit more interesting. I can also add a bit of motion blur. And there we go. Now for the bottom one, I want to show you a different technique, and that's using the character drop down. Now something else to know here is that wherever your playhead is also where the animation is applied from. So if I want it here back at the beginning, then I have to drag these back or have my playhead here at the start. Now, if I select these, I can make them easy ease and then add a little bit of animation to this just to help smooth out that effect. Now it looks okay, but at the moment it's animating in from the wrong position. Now with any animator, what you can do is if you come down to the animation settings, you can basically control it by using the offset. But if you come down to the position, you can control where it is animating in from. Now at the moment, I don't want it animating. I don't want to see the top part of this animation. I want it hidden. So again, like in the previous video, what I can do is draw a shape path over the top and then set this using the alpha matte settings to alpha invert, and that's going to hide that layer as it animates in. If I want to adjust that, I can just drag up or down on this layer here, or the shape layer, and then we end up with something slightly different. I can also adjust that animation position by dragging in on these points. So that's how you can combine those two techniques to create an interesting sort of animation. And that's what really takes your animations to that next level. It's about taking different effects and layering them, right? So don't just look at just doing one drag and drop function. If you combine a couple of those functions together, you could get something quite interesting. But here we're using two different techniques, applying them together to get something a bit more interesting. For the shape, what I'm going to do is make sure I have nothing selected. And I want to draw a line that goes over the front here. And then I can give this one a bit of a stroke effect here. Rename this one to blue. And then basically come down here and again apply that trims path. And again, with those layers, what I can do is come into the graph editor and I want to make this a little bit more interesting here. So I'm just going to drag up on this and it just makes that a smoother animation. Now, if I duplicate this and offset it 3 times here, we've now got 3 layers that sit over the top of each other. With our bottom layer selected, I can come down here and change the colors. And there you go. If you want to offset this even more, you can see more of those shape layers or delays that effect. And there we go. We have something that's quite interesting. So that's it for this video. I've shown you a few new different techniques and principles, stuff that you're really going to use a lot of inside of After Effects. And really, I know it's quite basic and some of you may even think this is too basic. But what you'll find is when you get into more advanced sort of animations, or even some of the animations we're going to do later in this course, you're going to see a lot of these techniques being used again and again and again, but they're all layered. So you want to try and get your head around this, because what will happen otherwise is you'll just look at an animation and kind of be overwhelmed by all the different things going on. If you break it down, these are just simple techniques that are being used, but they're just being layered together to make interesting results. So that's it for this video. If you have any questions on this particular video or any of the other videos in this course, don't hesitate to let me know.